So good evening, and welcome on the occasion of the opening of Martine Syms' exhibition at the Audain Gallery. And my name is Melanie O'Brien, for those of you that don't know me, the director of SFU Galleries. Before we begin, it's just important to acknowledge that we are visitors here on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, gratefully. And I'm just here to really introduce Amy Kazimirchuk, SFU Gallery's Audain Gallery curator and the curator of the exhibition downstairs, Borrowed Lady, who will in turn introduce tonight's speakers or conversationalists, Martine Syms and Laura Marks. But I also, just before we got going, wanted to let you know about two other events that we have this week. So on Friday at 7 o'clock in this room, Melanie Boteloup, the director of Baton Salon, which is embedded within the University of Paris, will be speaking about her practice. And I've just spent the day with her. She's a very interesting woman. And then on Saturday at 7 o'clock in the cinema upstairs, we'll have Lucy Lepard speaking about her recent publication, Undermining. So I hope you can join us for both of those things. Amy.
Hello, thanks for coming, you guys. I just would like to thank first all of the people who put a lot of time and energy and wisdom into making this exhibition happen. Firstly, Melanie, who just spoke, Cassidy Richardson, who works with me down in the gallery, and Karina Irvin, who works with us up at SFU Gallery. Our preparatory team, Dylan McHugh, Derek Brunin, Kevin Romaniak, Julian Howe, Stephen Snell, and Neil Chung for a huge amount of significant work on putting this up, so thank you. Just move this a little bit. This evening's conversation between LA-based artist Martine Syms and the Grant Strait University professor in SFU School for the Contemporary Arts, Laura U. Marks, introduces Martine's first solo exhibition in Canada titled Borrowed Lady. It's an appropriate format for an introduction to an installation, which is an expanded, circulating, dialogic version of her 2015 single-channel video, Notes on Gesture. The first iteration of this video developed from a conversation between Martine and the actress Diamond Stingley about the influence of family, friends, fictional characters, and historical archetypes on how a person physically acts and speaks. They were interested in what distinguishes being from acting and performing from becoming. To produce Borrowed Lady, Martine invited LA-based editor Nicole Otero and sound composer Celia Hollander into the dialogue. They passed the audio and visual source material back and forth in a relay, responding to each other's observations and decisions, and resulting in a 4-channel installation that reflects the circulation of ideas, images, gestures, and language in the production, performance, and expression of being. Echoes of Martine's 2015 performance lecture, Misdirected Kiss, which she performed last January at the Western Front and at the Broad in Los Angeles. Her 2016 exhibition, Fact and Trouble, at the ICA in London, and 2015 exhibition, Vertical Elevated Oblique, at Bridget Donahue in New York, are also audible and visible in the installation. So I wanted to bring Laura into this conversation for numerous reasons. Laura and Martine are both invested in the experience and perspective of the reader of images, objects, and text. Martine has critically reflected on reading through her unique roles as co-owner of Golden Age Books in Chicago, publisher of Dominica Imprint in Los Angeles, lecturer, essayist, screenwriter, and editor. And Laura has written 4 books, including Hanan al-Cinema, Affections for the Moving Image in 2016, and curated countless programs of experimental cinema from around the world, including the 2015 Flaherty seminar, The Scent of Places, about how moving images are formed within the conditions of cultures and contingencies of politics they emerge from. They are both conscious of the experience of the body in the cinema, black box, and gallery. In both of Laura's books, The Skin of Film, Intercultural Cinema, Embodiment, and the Senses, as well as Touch, Sensuous Theory, and Multisensory Media, she focuses on how the 6 senses of the body are active in the perception and identification within cinema, which itself is a material body with sense attributes. And they both possess a strong sense of the primacy of media in contemporary life and its influence on identity, In Martine's installation, the apparatuses on which her works are presented, her color palettes, and the way she shoots, collects, and edits her footage is itself in a relay with how media forms have transfigured cultural, familial, and historical memory. So with that, I will let them take the stage, and we're going to give them about 30 minutes to develop the rapport between them before opening up to the audience. And then close to 7, we will close to resume in the gallery for the opening reception.
All right. Thank you, Amy, for that wonderful introduction that made us both sound so great. And and thank you, Martine, for inviting me to do this dialogue with you.
Yeah, thanks for being here. Thank you all for coming.
So I have a lot of questions for Martine. I have a lot of questions for you. And I want to start by talking about the embodied response that your installation downstairs gives rise to. So let me describe that a bit. It's a very, it creates a lot of disjunction in a viewer in a really interesting way, because you are intensely performing all these gestures, and some of them, I feel are owned. Some of them are clearly, performed and and mimicked. Some are easy to borrow. Some are not easy to borrow. So for me, as a viewer, I can't help but resonate with the embodiment of all these gestures that you make. But at the same time, for some of them, there's a kind of whiplash feeling that I do not want to embody this, or this is not mine to embody. Especially in the case of some gestures that get black gestures that get appropriated by white people. So this creates a sort of whiplash relationship in my embodied response. And then on top of that is the editing, the image and sound editing, which creates a very kind of staccato response in me as a viewer. So it's really satisfying, but it's not something that one could ever kind of relax into. So I'd like you to talk a bit about the embodied states of those gestures, and how it is for you to choose them, practice them, perform them, and kind of let them out.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the video, I should say, sort of started me looking at a text that came out in sort of 1644. There was this book called Curlogia, and it's like this language of the hand. So I was really interested in this idea of, if you're sort of constantly on screen, whether through a kind of ambient like footage that's being collected, whether it's just like CCTV in a store or in public space, or it's somebody recording an event on their phone, or whatever, like how that affects your kind of performance just as a person walking around. And so then I started looking at like acting techniques, and that's when I came across this book, and I found a lot of these parallels between, this sort of almost like Shakespearean way of moving, and actually stuff like emojis really is part of what it reminded me of, some of the hand gestures there, and then the ways that those different things were coded, and that kind of affective coding like still was relevant. And thinking about that in terms of a digitally circulated image, especially like reaction GIFs, like that was one in terms of the staccato of the and Vine, or these kind of short form that I was really looking at formally, and the way that those are edited. So that was a part of wanting to do that. Essentially, it's a collection of reactions in a way, and in this form, they're reacting to one another. So there are a lot of maybe just feelings that emerge. So in the single channel, I think that's much more immediate, but in this, through the process of this kind of relay that Amy was talking about, with Celia specifically, she's really, a lot of her work is sort of sample-based, and which I am interested in because I often work in loop and with repetition. So she sort of took the audio and made samples out of it, and so found, it was already sort of, I was already kind of making these loops, but she really drew them out and then made this piece. So then when I went back and we were editing to her composition, it becomes much more uneasy, I guess, in a way. And I wanted it to be very, like you're saying, sort of unavailable, I guess, maybe in a way. Like some of what's happening is a dialogue between me and the performer, or the things that we're talking about. And so it's kind of like you're sitting within it, but you can't quite access maybe all of the, there's sort of an intimacy between us that is inaccessible. And I forget, I was going to say one other thing, but I've forgotten it.
Okay. Well, I love that you mentioned animated GIFs, because the short movies downstairs, that they produce these kind of impossible forms of movement, and like animated GIFs do. Yet when we look at an animated GIF, we feel that reaction, right? You feel it. You're like, so in a way, it's almost like you're producing a kind of a science fiction, sort of an impossible kind of embodiment.
Yeah, and I think that's something I'm interested in, is the way that, you kind of, this is like kind of maybe a tangent of an example, but like if you've seen this movie, The Fifth Element, one of my favorite films.
I love that movie.
It's like a sci-fi movie with Mila Jovovich where she's like, I don't know, the world is ending and they have to save it. But when they're on another planet, there's
multipass.
yeah, exactly. So there's a point, there's a performance, this kind of operatic performance within the film that was synthesized and was only sort of made possible through post-production. But then after that was made, like I think it's like a Romanian version of the voice. There's like a singer, a vocalist who re-performs this impossible kind of performance. And so I think that's another way of this kind of embodiment of you trying to mimic something that was only made possible through the sort of construction of the image, and then trying to have that in reality, or kind of going back and forth between those modes. And then I definitely think while you're watching it, in any way when you're sort of watching or with a person, you kind of mimic their posture, or you kind of make the same facial expression that they're making it. You're doing that a bit, but the pace of it, maybe makes you feel a bit crazy.
Yeah, this is really interesting because it touches on something that I've thought about and wondered about for years, which is where does our embodied being come from? Like obviously we're always learning new forms of embodiment, and deciding what to take on, and learning from our families and the people around us, but also making personal choices, like style choices. So I think there's kind of a dialectic between something authentic or sort of unconsidered, and something chosen and cultivated. But what I always wonder, like, what are the two ends of that? And are there any kinds of movement that are really, just like false or inauthentic? Or is every kind of movement or gesture, this is really what I'm still wondering about. Are there kinds of movement that are really, true and authentic? Are there kinds of movement that are absolutely false? or are they all simply performed with more or less degrees of convincingness? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's really what I was thinking about through working on this piece. A lot of was, what is this kind of, just if you kind of take an assumption that anytime you're being watched, you're performing, which is problematic, because then what are the limits of sort of performance? What is sort of truly yours or not yours? And I think, kind of thinking about that, I didn't come to any definitive answers. I would say it's all up for grabs to a degree. I think that's why I was so interested in this idea of this sort of prosthetic memory that I talk about a lot. Alison Landsberg sort of writes about that you can sort of take on these things that aren't yours, and I guess if you can take them on, you can also kind of take them off. Yeah.
I'm wondering if I should ask you more about prosthetic memory. Nope. I am going to.
I have a question for you.
You want to put you? Oh, okay.
Well, I'd say we were kind of talking about the difference maybe between haptic, these kinds of ways of embodiment, and you mentioned haptic. I can't remember the term that you used for the other version. I was just curious if you could unpack sort of the differences between those two ways of embodying images.
Yep. I think there's a lot of ways that a moving audiovisual image can make an embodied response, and the one that I'm best known for is haptic visuality, where the image is kind of literally tactile and your eye sort of palpates it. There's a lot of other things that make this effect, like sound, which can also have kind of a multisensory effect. I find that in your work, the tactile effect comes mostly through mimesis, through the response of the viewer's body to the performing body. So it's like a body-to-body contact. Cool. I also wanted to mention that one way that I get around this problem of like is an image, is a performance or an action authentic, is something, because is to think about it in motion and constantly being both performed and received. So basically, if something becomes authentic if it's received by people out in the world, and they say, yes, I feel what you're doing and I understand it and I will carry it on. Whereas if it falls flat, your sign didn't work. So that's. But I want to ask you. I want to ask you about the color purple.
Oh, yeah.
I was kind of thinking, I'm going to save that to the end, but I may as well do it now. So the color purple is really important in a lot of your work.
Yeah,
and
very present.
Yes, and it's in a lot of ways, it refers to a spiritual practice of the presence of God. Could you talk about that?
Sure. I think initially, my use of the color was from a project that I was doing called Belief Strategies. That was I was looking specifically at the film adaptation of The Color Purple and was sort of very obsessed with that as something very formative to anyone sort of sharing my socioeconomic background and why that was, and the forces that kind of made that come to be. And within the book, obviously, between the book and the film, a lot of things change. And one of the biggest sort of outcomes for this film was really Steven Spielberg's sort of dramatic career. So I found that interesting, that this white man, kind of, he's not an auteur, but genius director, was one of the most successful people from this book that was from this sort of black, radical, like feminist history. And obviously they changed or sort of neutered a lot of the ideas. But within the book, purple signifies this sort of representation of God, like you're saying, or this space where the spiritual is present in a secular environment. And I was kind of thinking about the ways that some of these productions or kind of classical Hollywood cinema functioned as a kind of belief system. And so that was like how I started using purple. And then it sort of has acquired, or continues to sort of acquire meaning for me, but also as people see it, people sort of give me more, their own associations with the color. Another just point of reference, I guess, is Julie Dash's use of it, especially in Daughters of the Dust. It's like really key for the film palette because it's sort of the indigo stain. She's sort of talking about specific slave trade, essentially, and crop that was farmed in part of the States, and it being this kind of mark on everyone's hands, but then this kind of generational mark through the costume and through the color and all those things. So I was also interested in it as a color that is like sort of a stained, obviously it's, and then another way it just is like a sentence. It's like a text. Like when people see it, they still think the color purple. And I like this sort of mix between obviously that phrase, because it is the title of the book and movie and Broadway production, so on, is linked to several like ideologies as well as time period. And I think my background is in film. Like that's what I sort of studied and I'm very invested in. And so the idea of kind of when I'm working on an installation, I'm still thinking of some of those things, maybe of like time and character, and the setting, location, like in a way that are all kind of being brought to bear like within that experience, and the sort of gallery space itself as sort of participating in it. So within this show, there's like a 360 or sort of panorama that the image presented in, but there are these kind of breaks in that, and also breaks within the actual video itself that are just sort of color cards. And so then I was thinking that the space sort of becomes a part of that set, so you're within that environment.
That's all really interesting. I want to push your answer just a little bit, and you can go ahead and say, no, that really is not relevant at all. And that color, you use it a lot, and there's a very specific color that you use. I forget, like some Pantone color or something. And it's here now. So you speak about the semiotics of that color and the cultural associations. Starting with Alice Walker's novel. And then the kind of, how the title made Spielberg famous. But we still have that color, which has a really intense effect that I think is a little bit free of those, semiotic associations. I think it just does something to us. And in the novel, and you have mentioned this, I think it's Shug in the novel who says that the color purple, and in the movie they're walking through a field of cosmos, which are more like pink actually. But she says the color purple is a reminder that God loves us and wants us to be happy or something like that. So, I see you really don't like this. but you have mentioned it yourself, Martine, and this is why I'm pushing it. So, there is kind of this sort of a joy that color can give, that doesn't get completely weighed down by all those associations. And you must like it because you use it.
Oh yeah, I definitely like it. I do think it's kind of like a bit of an outrageous color, and I've have found internationally, they're like purple ladies, you know, like I always see them on the bus, I feel, but
my mom is one.
Yeah, that like, I don't know how they all got this like subcultural association, but they are in head to toe purple. They have purple glasses, purple like earrings on, like, and I do think there's something that I really like about that, because it's also in large doses maybe kind of ugly too, or could be thought of as being really ugly. And so I like playing, I guess. I mean, I do like the color, we can say that. It's just my favorite color. But that's also almost the least important thing in a way. Like, it also has become my favorite color, or like, maybe it's not, but I just use it all the time in another way too. But I do think there's something sort of like, yeah, like maybe a bit of audacity, like with using it or wearing it, especially in large doses. And I know I have definitely been told how ugly purple is. There's a lot of purple haters too. And I think it's similar, maybe my interest in that is also similar to interest in using certain typography or these other kind of signifiers like alongside color that are, you know, obviously so intertwined with taste, which is so produced by all these other factors. So I think that's something I like. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really, it's interesting that, I mean, the color itself, the color that they're talking about originally, you know, it's not, color is, you know, not independent of texture.
Yeah.
And they're talking about like flowers, you know, fabrics, but in, you know, like the typeface for the movie, or in your walls, or in that one there, it's, you know, completely flat and lacking in texture. And I think that's the purple that people think is ugly. And I shouldn't have, I don't mean to say a bad thing about my mom. My mom, she wears purple and orange.
Yeah, well, I love
she's
purple
a
ladies.
fabulous woman. I would like to ask you about your mundane Afrofuturist manifesto. I'm sure everybody here knows about Afrofuturism, the really brilliant and radical movement of artists, musicians, filmmakers to kind of invent an idea that the African diaspora was equivalent in its violence to, and innovation to making it as though African diaspora people actually come from outer space. So there has been something very liberating and creative about that, but Martine has rightly criticized its excesses in what you call the mundane Afrofuturist manifesto. I'd like to, I would just like to ask you to speak about that a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think my initial impetus for writing was being invited. I was suddenly starting to get invited to all these Afrofuturist like panels and like screenings and like for what, and I wasn't sure why. I was like, why people keep asking me? I know I use digital technology, don't we all? And have made work for like the web, but that was like one thing that I was like, sort of like, why? Suddenly it was just like out of nowhere, a resurgence obviously of it as a kind of term. And there was an exhibition at the Studio Museum a couple of years ago that I think was also part of this, and maybe some other more pop things that were going on, but suddenly everybody was talking about Afrofuturism and were really wanting to bring me into the fold of it. For what I felt was a sort of weak tie when I'd ask people, and it was just because I was using technology. And I sort of felt like, that's not what Afrofuturism is. And so I was asked to kind of write about a piece that I was working on, which was sort of a sci-fi story. And I had come across like years before just this mundane science fiction manifesto, which was, I want to say Jeff Ryman and sort of Clarion West workshop, just like this writing workshop in Seattle. That's like a prestigious sci-fi like program. And one year they had written this manifesto that was sort of against the canon of science fiction as, in some ways, being escapist, but more their kind of concern was that if people were just thinking about, basically people weren't thinking about the environmental effects, and that like the real things that are happening environmentally, socially, culturally are like as sort of enough to sort of imagine and play with. And so they had written this thing, and it got a lot of backlash and conversations, and so some reason I just popped in my head as like a framework for posing this sort of critique. Definitely I was wanting it to be funny, or it was funny to me, I should say it that way. It was funny to me, it made me laugh as I was writing, and so that's all I can hope for. And so I just use that as a kind of way of just making this opposition. I also think manifestos, you know, like by their nature, you're supposed to kind of take this like hard line position. And that's typically, I feel like I am always expressing ambivalences. So it was also fun to just take on a voice of like absolute certainty. And, but the funnier thing to me was that it really did replay a lot of similar things of what happened with the mundane science fiction one. So there was a lot of dialogue and outrage at my dismissals. But really at the foundation, I'm just interested in maybe Afrofuturism as more of like a methodology, a way of working, and a way of thinking about speculation as a kind of tool for imagining different values dominating, or it's really just this sort of playful space. And I think speculation's obviously used in whatever derivatives, finance, all these different ways that it ends up affecting us very directly. But just thinking about that as a tool, I'm really interested in how you can assign value to something or increase its value. I think that also brings me back to this purple, like it's also acquired more meaning in my own work because I just use it a lot. So, or the way that language shows that too. So that was kind of how I was interested in my investment in, you know, I never would have called myself, I mean, I still have never called myself an Afrofuturist, but I am interested in Afrofuturism as a way of working.
Well, I'm actually pretty disturbed to hear that people tried to bring you into the fold of Afrofuturism because you use technology.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of awful. But in turn, I think that there are some really outrageous things in your manifesto, like saying that people should stop wearing metallics.
Oh yeah, no metallic colors.
And shouldn't stop enjoying Parliament Funkadelic. And that is very harsh.
Yeah, no more references. That was what I said, no more references to George Clinton and or Parliament Funkadelic. But I also think there's just there's other people you can bring in.
Mm-hmm. But you do, I mean, seriously though, your mundane Afrofuturist manifesto has this this kind of nub of truth, or whoops, I said truth. This really useful nub of kind of Tunis, where a thing keeps on splitting from its representation, and it just keeps like generating more and more new stuff because it's not happy being where it is. And you refer to it as Tunis, which I think is W.E.B. Du Bois.
Yeah.
So that's the idea that that's completely in line with Afrofuturism's idea that African diaspora people just can't ever be comfortable in the dominant semiotic system, and so have to keep generating something new. And that action, that kind of continuous sort of exfoliation of signs is kind of what's going on in the installation downstairs too. So I really think it's wonderful that you say this can be a quite small gesture, this constant making of difference. You don't need to wear, silver platform boots to do it.
Yeah, definitely. I think, and in some ways, I'm almost interested in like the smallest difference that can be, like the point, almost like, definitely In the Break is something that was really influential to me, is Fred Moten's text, but this idea that point of the cut or where that's placed, and in some of the shots, it's like there's two different shots, but they look really similar. There's points at which you think you're watching a loop of what just happened, but it's not a loop, it's another moment. Or I think that's why I'm really interested in repetition as a way of teasing those out, but also as a way of kind of making something continuous and then like destabilizing the continuity that it just built. And yeah, I think that is really something that excites me in terms of making, is like, what's the like smallest point of difference I can make? What's the smallest gesture I can make to do that? I definitely don't think you have to be wearing platform shoes.
Silver ones.
Yeah, silver ones.
I do want to ask one more question. Can I ask one more question before opening it up, Amy, or do you feel that it would be a good time to open it up? Great. Okay, this is a different kind of question. It's about your platforms for production. I think it's really interesting that you work in a number of different ways. Amy mentioned the two publishing companies that you ran successfully, and you do one now. And since there's a lot of young and practicing artists in the room who are, also trying to work on, work in multiple platforms to survive and, diversify as artists. It's interesting to talk about that, but there's actually a more specific area of that I personally am interested in, which is when moving image media artists make the decision of whether to exhibit their work in installations or as single channel works. And you mostly go the installation route, but I noticed that your work is also distributed by Video Data Bank, right?
Yeah.
So that means that it'll also be shown single channel. And I'd like to hear you talk about your decision and it's also, some of it is also available online. So I'd like you to talk about your decision to allow your work to be shown in these different platforms, aesthetic and economic.
Yeah. Well, in a really sort of simple, like straightforward way, I think that just my age and nerdiness made me like interested in putting videos online, like as a part of a lot of just like online communities, even just before YouTube and then afterwards, where that was a really just immediate, I think immediacy was something I was interested in. Immediately making something, putting it out, having people watch it, and sort of sharing it. And my, my own interests were very much coming from, I was really involved in sort of like film co-op at Echo Park Film Center in Los Angeles, and like organizing, like music shows and having independent music, like kind of like just making records, distributing that kind of stuff. So that way of just making something and then releasing it was just very foundational for me. So initially that was it. That was all it was. It was just, I'll put something here and people can watch it. And then I think maybe my commitment to it in a way, because I think there's the economic definitely comes into play in this sort of screening versus installation, but it's not so much of a versus to me. I just think I'm interested in the sort of accumulation of the ways that you see these different things in the encounter that you have. And I find when I'm working in installation, I sort of mentioned some of the considerations I take, but there's also a lot of times I'm sort of moving the viewer around, or sort of there is a real like experiential element to watching the videos or being in one of the video installations. And yeah, I don't know, so there's that. I'm trying to think. It's like very natural for me. I don't know, that's why it's hard to sort of talk about, is there's not much that I'm thinking as far as I just want people to see work in different ways. And yeah, but I was very much part of organizing screenings and this sort of micro cinema culture. So all my work's always been screened sort of fair amount in that environment. But I always wanted to do shows. It's just for shows you need space. And so there's kind of that, yeah, it's just sort of a basic thing. Yeah, I don't know. I don't really have a great answer for it because it's just a natural way of working for me.
Yeah, that's fine. That's great. I bet there's lots of people who have questions, and I see a number of my extremely brilliant and thoughtful colleagues out there, but I also see a lot of students, and often what happens at these things is that the brilliant professors are the ones who ask their questions first, and then we run out of time. So I really, really encourage students to ask questions. It doesn't have to be brilliant. Probably anything that you're curious to know about is going to be interesting for everybody. So just take a moment to think about what you would like to ask. And I'll look at the color.
Meditation break.
You were talking a bit about performance. Oh, I'm sorry.
I'll formulate out. I'm thinking it out loud as I speak it. But in the beginning, you talked something about you were talking about performance and if we're being watched in certain situations, and that there can be. I can't remember what you said, but there's like the problem is where are the limits of performance? And so I think like a lot of times we acknowledge like what is the limits of performance, but also what are our feelings like for or against? Like, is performing all the time bad? Is it not bad? I've been thinking a lot about Instagram culture, and I've seen a lot of videos of like peers or young women doing videos of themselves dancing in their room, and I'm like, okay, that's cool that people are feeling happy and want to share, but also what about like for personal pleasure too? Like, if everything is now for performance, what about doing actions alone when we're not being watched? So I don't know if that makes you think of anything interesting. It'd be cool to hear.
I mean, I can speak for myself, I guess, that I get very tired of performing, certainly. I think I was sort of saying I was really, a lot of my early subject formation happened online, and in the more recent years I've been really like sort of feeling alienated by the kind of separate self that exists there. And has made me really interested in, I guess, that idea of thinking of if I'm ever like unconscious of that, how I'm coming across or something like that. So I think I definitely experienced great fatigue by it. But then maybe that's, what you're going to experience. I guess what I'm interested in is then how that starts to be represented, because I know I'm not alone in that feeling. And so what if the dancing video is a sort of like trope we can say about like everyone wanting to perform, then there's also sort of another visual trope that's starting to develop. I'm more on Twitter, so I can definitely speak about that. That there's like a way that people talk about being tired of. They're tweeting. I shouldn't say talk. They tweet about being tired of tweeting or reading tweets. So I think there'll be like a visual trope that develops from the fatigue, and that's more what I'm like interested in. Like, same way that there's sort of these like cinematography styles that develop through whatever dance videos or other forms of selfie that then sort of make their way towards larger productions. Yeah, I guess I'm interested in the like formal way that it'll develop. Hello.
Is it working? No? I can just speak real loudly. I just love that thing about fatigue, right? I would like to hear more about that, but maybe I'm thinking about it in relationship to Afrofuturism and how it developed in the 60s, right? So my idea of fatigue and entropy, right, comes perhaps at the beginning of, I don't know, thermodynamics, right? It's in the 19th century, 18th century, right? You have scientists very interested in that. And then I see it in the 60s, 70s that it's not so much part of what people are talking about, but nonetheless you have people like Robert Smithson that are conceptually fatigued. But when I'm thinking about Afrofuturism, I'm really maybe thinking about the opposite of fatigue, right? We have an explosion. So now it's kind of interesting that it comes back. So thinking about looking back, right, about this moment, can you, because also the idea of having a mundane, you know, Afrofuturist manifesto kind of rethink what kind of historical era we're in.
Maybe something.
Yeah.
I'm prompting you.
Yeah, prompting.
Maybe something to do with like conserving energy. That the smallest gesture.
Right.
Yeah, like a kind of nano machine.
Well, part of what I was just thinking, I got, it's gonna like fly out of my brain right now. It did. Just give me 1 second to think about that question. I guess what I was, oh, I know what I was going to say now. I was going to say, I also think maybe repetition comes into that. It's like an exhaustion, or it's exhausting also to watch. So that's like part of the, maybe one manifestation of the fatigue. And then I also think, yeah, as a prompt, the conserving energy. Yeah, maybe that is part of it that I hadn't actually really consciously. I definitely do that. Conserve my own energy. I don't know. I think for me, positing a kind of mundane, it's definitely a marking, but I also sort of consciously making a joke about that marking, like marcation of time, in the same way Amy sort of mentioned this publishing project I used to do in Chicago was called Golden Age, as a kind of, we were sort of poking fun of this idea that there's ever been a golden age, or there's kind of all these impulse to be like, our time is the best time, or this time was the worst time, and now we've made progress, or now we haven't, which I really am not interested in sort of progress, even as a kind of just narrative structure. And so I think maybe that's sort of part of what that has to do with is a different relationship to time, or a different way of thinking about time. And when I'm maybe editing, I'll just speak really sort of technically in relation to a moving image, trying to find different time structures. Mm-hmm. And I think that's something within a lot of the music associated with Afrofuturism that I find inspiring, and a place to pull from, or use different time structures to organize a film.
Yeah, and those are both ways of generating a lot of energy from a small action, a small little difference in gestures and rhythms. Come on, you smart people.
First, thank you for the talk. And I think once I see your work in the installation exhibition, I will understand better about the context of what your talks are about. But from this conversation you had in the beginning about the embodiment of the gestures, and you mentioned emoji. And if I understand correct, emoji is composed with those independent codes, which to make images that are kind of independent, separate from its original function and shape and those meaning. So I wonder, when you're transforming those forms and change the media, is there any process you'll articulate about those rendering process, like gesture, movement, embodiment, and those codes?
Well, maybe also a thing to note is just the piece title is Notes on Gesture, kind of after the Gambin essay of this. Well, part of what I was really interested in, this idea of the image's ability to sort of remember movement and also be communicating. So I guess when I was talking about emoji, or how the emojis maybe were related, is I'd come across this, this sort of, very old text, and some of the symbols that were within it were like the same. They were coded in the same way, and they're people that I communicate with through text message that will communicate like solely through GIFs. So it'll just be like one repeating movement, and then they'll send me another, and that's well, we know what we're talking about. We can keep track of the conversation, but I was sort of interested in like, how is that possible in a way that some of these like movements or ways of holding a hand had retained the same meaning even through different cultures too. So that was maybe sort of how I started I don't know if translating is really the right word, but moving from these different formats of it and trying to find equivalences, I guess. And then also seeing where they started to break down. And in the process of shooting, a lot of times we were just having a conversation. So we were just talking, and she's making whatever gesture she's making. In many instances, I'm directing her to do specific things, but some of the weirder movements, or the ones that I would say aren't like recognizable, is just it was just maybe she just like moved her shoulder a weird way in between or after the action had been finished, but there's like these kind of other things. So I was also looking for maybe less decipherable gestures, or sort of how I could put them back into ones that were already established and kind of have this meaning, I suppose. Thanks.
Thanks. Thinking about your language of intimacy that you began with, which I think you looped us back to again in this response when you say things of looking for the in-between, the indecipherable, in those mundane, those small gestures. And one of the powerful things about intimacy are those sparrows of gestures that often are indecipherable, or that one can barely see. And so there seems to be, with the work that downstairs and talking about intimacy, seems to function a lot in this, in your method. So whether you're saying that trying to create a work where it's inaccessible to some of us, we are in it but can't seem to access those sparrows, intimate moment that was shared between between you two, or between the sound engineer and yourself, those things that we can experience, we can access, or even can understand. So what motivates that methodology in your practice? Yeah, thanks.
Well, I think it's part of why I was interested in talking to you, because I have such, I feel, an intimate relationship with a lot of the images that I'm looking at, and I'm such a, like, obsessively watching and saving material, that there is a bit of, like, yeah, I don't know, a relationship that I have to the images, and then when I go to make something, I guess that all comes about is that I still have this, yeah, just relationship with the image I'm creating very much, as well as with this performer. I mean, I have a relationship with that person too, and the person I worked on the sound with, everybody I work with, really, that says something that's very important to me, is that there's, I guess, a social life to my work. Yeah, and I think that maybe comes into play with what you're saying about these different platforms or different methods. I think it's just something I really value, is that separate from the work itself is a kind of whole, maybe, ethics and values of how I work with people and who I'm working with. Yeah, that is really tied on that. Yeah, and I think something I've been increasingly thinking about as I have showed in more institutional settings is how to bring that social life to that space, and or conversely bring that space to my sort of social life, and that dynamic. And that's something I am still figuring out completely. I think that's a big struggle, or something I've been struggling with, is how to do that and how to keep that charge, because I feel like that's a lot of where the energy in my work is. For me, definitely, for me making it.
Yeah, I think that I really like that you talk about the social, all those interactions, and that, the intimate relationship between you, the performer, the editor. No, you're the editor.
No, I worked with the editor as well.
The editor, the music person. So what we finally see in the gallery downstairs has been through a lot of discussions, and it's been really very kind of, very much worked over. And I do think that viewers can receive that, can, like, get a sense that what we are seeing in the gallery has already come through a lot of processes before it has reached us. And in large part because of the editing, because that's so dense, but also because it's heavily considered. So even though often, like, gallery video has a very minimalist look, I think you can feel the social, the work of a lot of people bringing together their expertise. So in that way, receiving that work, even for an individual viewer, is kind of like a completion of a social act. And then that carries on, if you talk about it, for example, or if it influences your own practice. So yeah, I mean, I've read you mentioning the similarity of editing, in editing video, and in editing books, and that like the participating in, like, pulling things together on this process of circulation that comes from and goes to the social. That's really very interesting.
Yeah, and some people are really don't think about the viewer when they're working on stuff, but I am definitely in the same way. I think in this similar thing of this same way of working on a film, working on a book. It's like I can't I'm like making it for the person watching it in many ways. So conceiving of that person in a way is like part of me making it, or it's definitely embedded within that. It's not like I'm making it for myself.
Wow. And what could be a nicer invitation than for us to go, I'll rush downstairs and go be that person. Oh, can I say one thing that's completely unrelated?
How unrelated?
It's completely unrelated, but I have the microphone, and I have a petition from the Dogwood Initiative with me for to keep more oil tankers off our coast. So if anybody would like to sign it, you can just come up to me during the reception. Sorry about that.
Just to pick up from where Martine left off, I just wanted to let people know that down in the gallery, the two of us have put together a bibliography of both texts that are influential on Martine's practice and this work, and a series of texts also about her practice. We also have a small library of a number of additional texts that are in fact not in that. You're totally welcome to peruse, and I think it does flesh out some of the relationship between text and reading and the production of book materials in the circulation of the materiality of her work. And then on the other level, she will be back in Vancouver on November 19th to give a tour of the exhibition with me. And so if after you've had a chance to watch the work and think about it a bit, you want to come back and ask her questions you didn't think about today, you can meet us in the gallery at 3 p.m. And then she's also going to be hosting a film screening in the cinema upstairs that evening. It's going to be a screening that she's going to program of film and video works that are circulating around the exhibition, although it's to be determined, so we'll see. It'll come out of probably some of the conversations over the next little while. But thank you very much for coming, and we'll see you downstairs.
Yeah, thank you guys.